Thanks very much, Anthony. It's very kind of you. So I'm not going to give an intimidating talk this morning, I promise you. I guess I wear a few hats these days. I'm a practicing medical oncologist at the Alfred Hospital, which is a large sort of tertiary academic hospital in Melbourne, linked to Monash University. I do run my own research laboratory, which is dominantly focused on melanoma, all types of melanoma, both cutaneous as well as non-cutaneous. But the other hat that I've taken on, excuse me, in the last few years is that as chair of our National Melanoma and Skin Cancer Cooperative Trials Group. And because we have melanoma in the title, it absolutely includes ocular melanoma. And so I just wanted to actually not talk about my science and talk about my work, but actually to talk about this national group. And I guess to point out to this wonderful audience here that we need to harness all this energy in the room to think about ways to support these sorts of national networks, which I strongly believe are the most important vehicles for making advances in diseases such as this, particularly rare diseases, where you really need kind of national, sort of extensive networks and strong national engagement. So the trials, so AOMA, the Australian Ocular Melanoma Alliance, is in essence a group within the entity which is known as Melanoma and Skin Cancer Trials. Melanoma and Skin Cancer Trials is this national cooperative trials group. It's an incorporated entity, a not-for-profit, of course. We receive federal government funding every year and have done so since about 2008. And that seeks to support our team to essentially develop and establish networks to be able to do the sorts of research and particularly the sorts of clinical trials and sort of clinical projects that are best enabled by developing and enabling large networks of people. So the sorts of studies where you need large numbers of patients and they need to be recruited from very disparate areas. There's a lot of logistical complexity about doing that type of research. And in essence, these groups are basically created to try and address those logistical challenges. Pretty much all of the major cancers, in fact most major non-malignant diseases as well, actually have their own national cooperative clinical trials groups, both here in Australia and New Zealand, but in fact all across different parts of the world. So it's a very well established means of doing this sort of type of large scale research. So melanoma and skin cancer trials, or MASK trials, as we've now called ourselves, as I said, is an incorporated entity, and we have obviously a lot of emphasis and focus on developing clinical trials in cutaneous melanoma, in fact other types of skin cancers. But we've made a very specific focus in the last 2 or 3 years since the new board has really come on to think about the really kind of high need areas within the broad field, so we've formed two specific subgroups within MASK trials. One is on a very rare type of skin cancer, which is called Merkel cell skin cancer, and there's been some fantastic progress in terms of therapies against that particular disease, even in the last couple of years. And as an example of the power of this group, we've been able to leverage some of those therapy developments to attract, I think it must be nearly now $3 million worth of funding for clinical trials to really take those advances in that disease to the next level. So the group really has the potential to, kind of leverage funding to support trials in those particular diseases, and we now have a pretty strong track record of doing that. However, much more relevant to this forum is the very exciting development of the Australian Ocular Melanoma Alliance, which has been developed really dominantly under the leadership of Anthony, who you will very well know now, who's just done an absolute sterling job in sort of coordinating it all. But he is supported, certainly from an admin and coordination point of view, by the team that we employ at Melanoma and Skin Cancer Trials. And the team is, just put your hands up team so we know where you are. So Narelle, Libby, Alex, the other guys must have been out partying too hard last night and they haven't made it here this morning. So Anthony and some other clinicians and researchers are receiving strong admin support from our team, and I think that it's such an exciting development. I keep sort of thinking back when I started medical school, and which was like back in the 1980s, when I guess the great kind of scourge of that era was HIV and AIDS, which was a relatively rare disease, but absolutely devastating, and for which there were basically very, very few treatments. And it was kind of remarkable, although I wasn't involved in the infectious diseases field, it was really remarkable to observe the change in the therapy space against that disease over about a kind of 10-year period, to the point in the mid-1990s where it essentially became a very manageable long-term chronic disease just through taking simple tablets. And it's important to appreciate that the dominant driver of that remarkable endpoint, if you think where we started, like in the sort of early to mid-1980s, that the dominant driver was in fact networks like this. So basically patients and researchers and clinicians getting together to work out how they could basically identify funding, identify the key research questions, identify the key problems, and to get activated and coordinated to basically raise money to support that type of work. And so to me that's the kind of great example of the power of networks such as AOMA, comprising consumers, researchers and clinicians, to make very massive improvements in the outcomes of patients affected by relatively rare and also very difficult to treat diseases. And that's why we're very excited to support and to develop AOMA going forward. And I think this is a real landmark event, our first national conference. However, I'm going to reach out and appeal to you in a very unapologetic manner. So at the moment, whereas our Merkel group has now developed some of its own funding streams to help the administration around that subgroup, we don't actually yet have a dedicated funding stream for the AOMA group within MASK trials. So at the moment, the board is essentially happy to kind of tip in and to contribute to the admin required to support AOMA. But it's not going to be sustainable because the group obviously has many other commitments based on the federal government funding that we receive. And so we really need, you guys, and I'll throw this over to the patient, family and consumer community, because it's ultimately you guys who really have the ability to drive this, is that over time, AOMA is going to need funding streams to enable its ongoing support and administration. And so I appeal to you to get together and think about ways in which you might be able to do that. Okay, so I'm very happy after this morning session to take questions about AOMA or to take questions about MASK trials. But right now it's my honour to introduce our next speaker, who is very well known to some in the audience because he made some remarkable contributions to our conference yesterday. So I'm talking about Professor Bertil D'Amato. He's a Professor of Ophthalmology and Radiation Oncology and also the Director of Ocular Oncology or Ocular Cancer Services at the University of California in San Francisco. And he also just happens to be a Senior Clinical Research Fellow at the University of Oxford in the UK. So he really works at the absolute top level institutes in the world. He's originally Maltese, which is where he went to med school, and before completing postgraduate training up in Glasgow. And in fact, he was one of the real dominant drivers of the development of the ocular ophthalmology service at the Liverpool Hospital in the UK, which is widely considered to be the leading effort against this disease in the world. So we're absolutely honoured and privileged to have you talking to us today, Bertil, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.